people. It's raining in the fjords here at the cabin, so I got to do this video inside. I finished a book. It's called The Song of Roland. It's a very old book. It was written in 1938. This is a first edition. It's kind of nice to have that. They've done some rebinding on this book, and I'd love to know how they did it, because I got a couple books at home that I'm afraid to even open up because I think they may fall apart. I got this book because it gets referenced in a lot of things that I'm reading. So I had a pretty good idea what it was. It's a little bit like the Iliad. Numbers, the size of these armies are greatly exaggerated, and I'm sure that Roland's prowess in battle is probably greatly exaggerated, but it flows pretty good. This is written by Miriam Sherwood, and when I inquired about this book, I got this at King Book. It's a used book. I had mentioned to this, there's a woman there that's very helpful, and I said, I find it impossible to read verse. And she says, "Oh, well, get this one. This one's, it's been translated to where it's not in verse. So it's still kind of verse-like, but it was a pretty enjoyable book. I don't have too many notes in here. This originally came from a library, so there's a kind of a cool sticker in the front of it about fines and everything, and it says, a fine of 2 cents a day, excluding Sundays and holidays, must be paid on each book kept overtime. So, the introduction is probably a lot more interesting than the rest of the book. The introduction tells about the book, and tells about when it was written, and it tells about, when the events happened that it's written about. So it sounds like it was written maybe 200-300 years after all of this. I'm also pretty interested in Moorish Spain, so this is during that time period. I'm having a hard time finding good books about Moorish Spain. I try to avoid ordering books. I like to get them at a used bookstore so that they're nice and cheap. So when you grow up in America and you go to school and you only have a little bit of college, you don't learn anything about early European history. You learn nothing. Basically, in school, you learn about American history, and we just don't have that much history, not compared to Europe. I'm not saying that some of our history isn't interesting, because it is, but Europe has got thousands of years of history where we only have like 600 or so. There's a woodpecker. The woodpeckers come and tap on my steel roof, and it's nice and loud for them. But when you read about Charlemagne and the Franks, for years I thought that they were French, and probably a lot of other people do too. I did some reading about the Crusades, and it's the Franks versus the Saracen in the Crusades, and I think it was in there's a really cool book called The Dream in the Tomb, and they're talking about this guy. I can't remember his name, but his nickname was the Carpenter, because he cut things in half. He cut horses in half, he cut camels in half, he cut Saracens in half. He was a Frank, and they describe him as a Germanic warrior at the top of his game. And so I read that, and that was my first clue as to who the Franks were. Over here on the shelf, I have The Kingdom of the Franks, and it explains it much better. The Franks originated east of the Rhine, which would make them definitely Germanic, and they kind of took over north central Gaul, which is what France would have been referred to at those times. And I just wanted to read she's talking about how difficult it is to figure out who actually wrote this originally. Much like the Iliad and Odyssey, there's two schools of thought for those two books. Most people say, "Oh, well, fucking Homer wrote those." That's not that clear cut. Homer, the name Homer was kind of like Thermos. Homer was such a successful bard that his name became associated with anything in writing. So he may not have wrote that. And I say it was like Thermos because, you know, any receptacle to keep a drink hot is referred to as a thermos. Thermos is a brand name. There's different ones. All right, so I'm just going to read one paragraph here and then I'm done. And forgive me for butchering any French names that's in here. Another baffling problem presented by the Song of Roland is that of the geography, particularly the geography of Spain. As far as France is concerned, there is little real difficulty. To be sure, the poet uses the term France and French somewhat loosely. He makes no apparent distinction between Franks and French. He speaks of Aix, A-I-X, that is, Aix-la-Chapelle, or Aachen, the capital of Charlemagne's empire, as in France. This is an incomprehensible mistake, unless, which must be the case, he meant by France the kingdom of the Franks, or empire of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, the great French emperor of the poet, was not French. There was no French language in his time, and he spoke a Germanic dialect. That's it. I'm actually out of books, so I'm going to drive all the way to Alpena, Michigan, where there's supposed to be a rare and used bookstore. Alpena's a long way for me from here. It's going to take most of the day. It's a good thing it's cool outside because I can leave my coolers. The ice won't all melt. I'm going to try and take back roads. I have county maps of Presque Isle County and Montmorency County, so that should be a little adventure for me today.